All right, then for the second part, okay, I'm gonna use similarly like this. So I'm gonna use the previous example. In this case, it was student data, right? So we're gonna use the student data class to perform this one. So instead of patient, I change it to student. So look at this. So the class name, create a class name student, and that student class will contain these two fields, ID number and age. There are one more three, and one is student data. Okay, and then provide a default constructor. So there will be two constructors. The default constructor will set the ID number to 0 and age to 0, and the student data value is freshman and male. So that's the default constructor. And the overloaded constructor is we will send all these three values. All right, and then write get method and send methods. It should be get and send method together. All right, then once you make it, let's check whether this one is working correctly. So let's try to make this student data student of class first. Okay, so this will contain three fields, which is I will make it private and ID. ID is an integer. ID, let's make a string as well. String as an ID, and then private age. Age is an integer, so let's make int age, and then student data. Private student data is we already have that class, so student data, and then SD. Why don't we use SD for student data? Okay, for the default constructor, public, use the same class name, student, and then no argument. So there's no argument, which means the default constructor. And from this one, we will set the ID to 0. Should I use ID to string? Well. Okay, let's make an integer. Okay, let's make an integer. So it will be 0, right? 0. And then the age is also 0. How about the blood type? In this, not a blood, student type, right? Student data. So student data is, now we need to create student data. Student data with default, right? Default. Because the student data, the default constructor will be, the value of the default constructor will be freshman and male, right? Freshman male. The student. Right? The default is freshman and male. So we are doing the same thing. So the default will be freshman male, so you can just call the default constructor. So this will create an object, and that object is assigned to SD, and this SD. Alright. And then let's make overloaded class. So this time this will receive 3 arguments. So the first one is ID, which is integer ID. The second argument is age. Age is integer, so write in int age. And the third one is student data. Student data type. And let's use SD. And then from this one, I'm going to set to this ID for this ID. Okay, I believe you understand this. So this ID is this guy, and this ID comes from this, and this is student. So student ID, which means this is for this field name, and this ID comes from this one, argument. And this dot age should be age. So if you are using different name, then you don't have to put this. In this case, you can just put SD is equal to S. So this S comes from this argument. This SD represents this one. Okay, so that is the constructors. And then now let's make set and get method. So for the set, there is no return value, so use void. So get a set ID. So ID is an integer. ID. So this dot ID is equal to ID. So that is the set method. Public void set age. Age is an integer, so int a. I'm going to receive it as an a. So since a is different from the word age, you don't have to put a. You don't have to put this. Okay, and then another one, public void set student data SD. So that is the data type student data, and let's make it as. So I'm going to assign S to SD. So that is set method. Okay, let's make a get method. So get method returns values. So for the ID, the data type is integer. So public int get ID. So get ID, and then this will return what? Return ID. Okay, public int now get age. So age return age, and then public. Okay, now student data. So student, what's the student data is student data, right? So data type student data get as student data. So this will return what? Student data, which is SD. Okay. So the student class contains student ID, age, and student data. Student data also contains what? The level, senior, freshman, and so on, and what? The gender, male or female. All right. So now let's create and demonstrate, whether this one works correctly. So let's make a class name, in application class name, test student. Class student. So this is application, so we gotta use public static void main string arc. Okay, let's create the student object. So student, I'm gonna create student object. So student 1. Can we student 1? Yeah, student 1. So that is new student. So this is a default constructor. So the default constructor will contain the information of what? This one. ID is 0, age is 0, the SD is also student data is default. Then let's create another one, student 2, the new student. This time let's send the values for all these three. So the age will be, let's say, 25. Oh, sorry, ID. Okay, ID. Let's use ID is 1, and then the age. The second argument is age, so that's 25 years old, and the data type. So the data type is the blood data, right? Blood data. So in that case, okay, wait a second. Okay, for this one student data, let's modify the student class. So when you receive this one, let's get the values for the student data. So the first one is freshman. So freshman is string, isn't it? So I'm gonna receive string as an argument. that is for level, string level, and the last one is male or female, right? Gender. So that is also string and gender. So I'm gonna send these two values directly. So instead of this, you can make SD is equal to the student data. The student data is now we're gonna create a new student data, an object of student data, and by sending these two values, level and gender. Level and gender. Make sense? So in this constructor, just like the default constructor, it created student data object and assigned it to SD. Same thing. You will create student data here by sending the student data information. So once it is created, it is assigned to SD. So this is more convenient. Alright, so in this case, so let's create student data. So ID is 1, 25 years old, and let's say this is senior, sophomore, and okay, female. Let's use female like this. Alright, so we just created two objects of students. One is default, one is using everything. So let's display this one. So let's display student 1 information and display student 2 information. Then where is the method for this student? Okay, we're gonna create it. So let's create this display method. Display does not return anything, so it will be public. So you are in the same static size, so use static, and then void, because this display does not return anything. Okay, static void. If this was returning an integer, then this will be int, but this one does not return anything, so make it void and use static because you are together with this static. And then you are receiving std, right? Std. So that's the data type is student. And then receive it as s. So you send student 1, this one, to here. You receive it like this. And then let's print out. System.out.println. Okay, so student get ID. So why don't we type here ID equals, so ID equals get the ID plus and then age, right? So age equals s dot get age plus. So when you call a method, make sure you put parentheses. Method always has parentheses. If there's no argument, then there's nothing in this parentheses. If there are arguments, then specify arguments. But our get age and our get method does not require any argument, so there's nothing inside the parentheses. All right, and then ID, age, what else? The level, right? Level. Okay, level is students. S dot get student data, right? Student data. And then from the student data, we can retrieve, we can get what? Is it get level, right? Level. Alright, let me change the line. Okay, look at this. The get student data is not SD. It is student data, right? Student data. So we gotta use the same name. Student data. So from student data, this will return the student data object, and from that object, you can call get level. All right, class, and then male, gender. So gender is equal to so student and get student data dot get gender. This makes more sense, right? Okay, did we miss anything? Get ID. This one should be a lowercase. Student one. So STD, right? STD. Display student. All right. This one has an error. Why? Display. Okay, there's no. The method name is spelled incorrectly. So display, right? Display. All right. So once we try this, then this will display the default information and another student information. Okay. So the first one is student 0. This is the default student information for the default student, and this is the information of the second student. Correct? All right, then let's try another example. Okay, why don't we put here student? This is for student 1, right? Student 1. Oh, it's not student 1. That's okay, since we put the student. Okay. Right. Why there is equal sign? Plus sign. Okay, let's check. Let's modify some values. All right, then let's change the data for student 1. So okay, for the student, the information for student is, the age is 0, everything is not correct. So let's change it. So student 1 dot set age. So this time let's set the age to 20. And then let's create the data type. Okay, the student has age, ID. So let's leave ID as, let's not change ID, but let's change the age. And then let's change the student data information. So like this. So let's create student data, and then SD1. Okay, SD1. New student data. Okay, now it is junior, and then male. So from here, we create an object of student data and set it to SD1. So I'm gonna change the student1 dot set student data. to what? SD1. Set student, is it SD or is it SD? SD? Student data? Yeah, student data is SD. SD. I should have used the same name. Okay, anyway. So that is SD, student data, SD. So you create an object, and then this object is sent to as an argument and set the student data in for the first student. Make sense? Okay, you want to change OR's ID? Okay, let's change the ID to 100. So now the information of student 1 it has changed to ID is 100, age is 20, and the student data information, which is junior and male, is updated. And then let's display student 1. So this should display this information instead of the default information. Okay, so here you go. So this is the default information, student 1, right? And this is the student 2. And this is the new information for student 1. Age. Okay, I printed out twice for this one. Because the age is, ID is 100, age is 20, junior and the male. Okay, let me just get rid of this one. Alright, so that is all about this. So this is correct. So your homework will be very similar to this. And this one explains how to create object and then how to use those objects. So create an object, use that object, and then for the object class you can make public public methods, send method and get method, so that you can use those methods from different class. So from this application part, you can create an object using defaults or overloaded information, and then you can reset those values. Then you can retrieve those values using get, and then you can display. So from here, or you can make something like this. We are using get as get student data, as get student data. So why don't we use this one? Let's create a data field, students. Student data. So let's make it D. So the D is s dot get student data. All right. So from this student object, I will get the student data, and the student data stored in D. So instead of using this part, why don't we use D dot get level? Gender equal, do the same thing. What we are doing is just replace S get student data into what? D. So this should work same, because the get level is in student data, right? Student data, this one in student data, and this student data is in this student. So instead of using all the way down, you can make this one as student data and then access D instead of this. Same thing. All right, so good luck everyone. and then make sure you get the concept of the classes, creating objects, make classes and create objects and other methods. Okay.